Good evening, Sammy. I'm Jesse, and I welcome you to the Ivory Tower Collections game room. And sitting here beside me is your Atari Lite 6er. And it's done. At least, I'm pretty sure it's done at this point, and it's ready to come home. So, the purpose of this video is to go through and describe in detail the services and upgrades that have been provided on your console, and also to give you a basics on how to use the upgrades that have been installed, and also to show you some gameplay video and just some, basic demo footage of your console in action so that you can see that everything is working great. So let's start with what's been done on your console, because there was quite a bit that was done. So for starters, when it arrived, the first thing I did was to actually go ahead and plug it up into an old RF input setup that I've got up in my lab and verified that it looked like functionally everything was working fine. And it was, actually. That's why I was surprised when you had told me in an email just a few days ago that you were having issues with the audio output, because that wasn't the case for me. But I did find just one minor issue with it when it arrived, and that was the fact that your reset switch, not only did it not feel very good using it, but it also wasn't registering at all. So I had to completely, as part of the repair process, take the reset switch completely off the board and essentially take it apart and essentially clean it out and rebuild it from scratch. On the other switches, they seem to be working fine, so all I had to do with those was just spritz some contact cleaner in them, and then I apply very light coating of dielectric grease inside them, which is just to help keep the contact points clean a little bit better and to prevent any corrosion in the future. It's not 100%, but it's better than what Atari did, which was absolutely nothing at all. They just basically just put the switches in and there you were. And then from there, I proceeded to go ahead and do some additional services. So I've gone ahead and replaced pretty much all of the electrolytic capacitors that this console have been replaced, including some that are not electrolytic type. And as I may have explained to you in a previous video, your Atari has definitely been opened up before by somebody else. And as near as I can tell, it is a Lite 6er shell. As we can obviously see, it doesn't have the thicker wide wall plastic on the sides. But on the inside, you have what appears to be a heavy 6er switchboard, but with the actual internal guts of a Lite 6er console. So it's essentially a hybrid or a combination of the two put together into a Lite 6er shell. And there's quite a bit of evidence to back this up. For starters, as I had mentioned, about half, there was like 6 screws missing from what would normally be present in a stock console. 1 or 2 screws missing isn't necessarily a huge deal. That can sometimes just happen over time. But yeah, it was kind of unusual in this case. Also, 2 of the screws that were missing actually install in the very bottom center of the shell. They are used to anchor the main metal housing box that houses the main electronics into place. So without those screws there was actually a little bit of play where this whole assembly could kind of move back and forth inside the console a little bit, which is not ideal. So again, I found some replacement screws that fit, that work, and put it into place. I even happened to find 2 washers that would have been used on those original screws, probably from another 6er that I had in here in the past that was a junker for parts. You have screws everywhere they need to be. They're not factory original Atari screws, but they're screws that work and fit. In some cases, though, some of the screws might still look a little different from the others because, as I had explained to you, part of the reason why I think the screws were missing on the inside was because the actual posts that they screw into were pretty stripped out. So the original screws that would have gone in there pretty much wouldn't even seat. They would just keep turning constantly and just basically fall out. So I had to use some slightly different screws, little wider screws, just to kind of cut new threads into what's in there so they would hold. So that's really it as far as the repair side of things goes. Now that takes us to the upgrade. Now your main request for the upgrade, of course, is the main star of the show, which is that you have a Lumacode AV upgrade installed. Now that upgrade consists of installing a new socket for the TIA chip, which is the television interface adapter chip. That's the main graphics chip on the Atari 2600. And in its place, we put a new socket, and then we have a new board, a new PCB that's got, you know, a lot of electronics on it, some sophisticated stuff, and that is the digitizer board. So that goes into the socket. And then finally, the actual TIA chip itself goes on top of that. So it's like the new PCB is sandwiched between the board and the TIA. And what that board does is it intercepts the original video signals that come out of that TIA chip, and it produces a new video output from it called Lumacode. Now, Lumacode is actually a composite level video signal. It's not really usable on its own. If you were to plug it into the actual yellow video input jack on a standard television, you would see a picture. It would be a black and white picture with a bunch of weird stripy lines through it. And that's because Lumacode is basically just the black and white luminosity, luminance, luma, of the actual video output signal, but those stripy lines is digital signals embedded that is fed into a separate converter box and generates the final HDMI output that we get in the end. So there's a lot more going on complexity-wise under the hood than what it will appear, but suffice it to say, it's pretty magical and it works great. So what else was done? Well, as you know, another thing that had to be done was you had informed me in an email that you were planning to use the new wireless controllers with this console. So I've got one of the CX78 or CX24 Plus controllers here, in addition to the little wireless dongle. And as you heard in a previous video, these have issues on the 6-switch consoles. Due to basically the design of these older consoles, the noise from the actual signals generated from the dongle bleed into the system and is then picked up and amplified by the audio amplification circuit that the games use. And as a result, we hear weird little tunes and hisses and weird stuff like that. So I advised you of this, and obviously you were disappointed by that. I was not aware that you were planning to use wireless controllers, or that would have been something I could have warned you about ahead of time. Regardless, you had looked around and done some research. I had done some research on this in the past, and you had sent me a link to this guy's YouTube video. And believe it or not, I had actually seen that video once before. So anyway, using his video, his final solution, as I basically tried to describe to you, I think, is that he cuts traces on both the switchboard and the main board inside that drives the 5 volts that power the controller ports. And that's because the signals that end up bleeding and getting amplified from the wireless dongle are actually bleeding into the 5-volt power rail in the system. So you cut traces that basically prevents 5 volts from going to the controller ports. And then you have to run one wire from the main board back to the switchboard to restore part of what that cut breaks. And then the other thing you have to do is you have to install a second voltage regulator in the console, which provides a new 5-volt source, an isolated 5-volt source, just to the controller port section. And that's what's been done. Because this guy's solution was to use a secondary voltage regulator, he was using the same type of voltage regulator that's already in the console. But that would have required a heatsink. And I really couldn't find an elegant way to set up another heatsink assembly inside of this that just didn't really look bodged in and just looked kind of, you know, nasty. So I went ahead and opted for, it's a higher cost part, which I'll have to add to the parts bill on this, of course. But basically they make modern replacements that use switching circuits to regulate the voltage. And the advantage is they don't generate any heat. The disadvantage is they can generate noise that can easily be picked up on analog equipment like this. But because of the way this works, and because the 5 volts that we're supplying to the controller ports is isolated from the rest of the system, even if that switching type regulator is producing noise, it doesn't matter because it's not being picked up by the rest of the main parts of the console. That's why I opted for that solution. I didn't need a heatsink. I could easily attach the little black box somewhere on the inside, trim up the wiring to the right lengths that I needed, and just try to make it look as nice as possible. Now, that takes us to the Lumacode stuff, because you are new to it, you don't know how it works, so I kind of need to give you essentially a basics on how to use Lumacode and its converter called the RGB to HDMI. So first of all, on the back of your console, you now have a new 3.5mm headphone type audio jack, and that jack has both the video and audio on it. It only needs just basically 2 wires to do that. So the way it works is you're going to have this little converter box. This is it right here. This is the RGB to HDMI converter box. It's not very big. It only measures about maybe 3 inches by about 1.5 inch by just a little over maybe 1.25 inches tall, give or take. That's my eyeball measurements at work. And on this box are 4 switches on the top of it. They are marked as SW1, SW2, SW3, and then there's another switch over here on the far right center side that's marked as RST. That is a reset switch. So as the name implies, when you press it, it just does a software reset on this little converter box. There's not going to be probably really any reason to have to use this, but it's included automatically as part of these little converter boxes. Now, on this box, there are a number of ports scattered about it. On one end, we've got a large opening here that also has what looks like a little headphone jack. And that's because the way this all works is you get an audio style cable, a 3.5 millimeter to 3.5 millimeter audio cable, which, by the way, I will be including this cable with this converter box as part of this project. So I'm going to try to have most everything in place that you're going to need to be able to use this pretty much out of the box and be up and going. But the point is you take one end of this cable and you're going to plug it into that headphone jack on the side of the converter box. The other end is going to plug into the matching headphone jack on the back of the console. And that's the only cable you need that goes from the console to this converter box. That's it. All of the video and audio is handled from this one cable. Now, in addition to this, this little box needs external power in order to operate. And in this particular case, if we take a look at one side here, and I know it's going to be hard to see, the lighting's not that great in my game room, I apologize, but there are 2 small little ports over here on the right-hand side of the box, and there's a larger port over here on the left-hand side. Now these 2 smaller ports, they are micro USB ports, and they are basically used to be able to provide power to this converter. One port is dedicated as power only, the other one is power and data, but it doesn't really matter which one you use, it can be powered from either port. The larger port over here is a mini HDMI output port. So the way all this is going to work is I will also be providing you with another cable, this blue one as it turns out. This is one of the newer ones I've gotten recently. I used to have these gray colored cables, but I don't know why, but they sent me some blue ones. So this has a micro USB to USB type A, like a standard USB port on one end. So the idea is that you're going to take this cable for the power side, you're going to plug it into one of those micro USB ports, like that. And then on the other end, with the USB A port, you can actually plug that into pretty much any 5-volt standard phone charger or a tablet charger. I actually plug my personal RGB to HDMI using the USB port off of my modern television, because most modern televisions in about the last decade include at least one USB port, usually to provide software updates. And that's actually convenient because not only does it provide enough power and current from the television to drive this little box, but there's no on-off button on here. So if you plug this in on your TV, well then this box will automatically power on when you power on the TV to be able to use it. So that's another good reason for maybe using your TV to power it. But you can also use other things. I've actually powered it by using the USB ports off of a computer, like when I'm doing video captures, for instance. I even have a USB port on my AV receiver here behind me on the front of it, and I've actually powered it using that before. Okay, so you're going to get this blue cable, micro USB, USB type A. And then for the mini HDMI side over here, I'm also going to be providing a mini HDMI to full HDMI cable adapter. And this is just going to plug right in to the larger port like that. And then on this end, you can plug in any HDMI cable that you probably already have on hand. So yeah, I mean, the whole basic setup is, you know, there's a lot of wires that basically come off of this little converter box, but it's small enough, and I've made the wires long enough that you should be able to tuck it out of the way somewhere so it's not super noticeable. But again, you will need to have access to it because the buttons on this are to control an on-screen menu for changing configurations on this little box. And as I'm going to show you later on, there may be some options that you may have to adjust and change when you receive this. So again, you know, this needs to be accessible in some way so that you can use it and be able to access it. But yeah, I mean, you got this cable here from the side that goes into the console side. You're going to have the cable for power going into a power source, and then you're going to have this cable going into your television for HDMI. And that's going to be it. So connecting everything up is really pretty easy. So what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to turn my camera around. I'm going to point it directly at my modern TV here behind me. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the menu options for using the RGB to HDMI converter, because again, it is new to you, and I want you to be somewhat familiar with it so that you already have, you know, so that you're already armed with some knowledge on how to use it when you get it. After that, I will go through the quick diagnostics cartridge that I have. I have some more in-depth diagnostics, but they're really boring to look at because they don't really show anything, and it's designed for me to use like my oscilloscope to check signals and things. But I'll show you a real basic one I've got that's at least visually shows something. And then from there, I'll show one or two games so that you can get an idea as to how everything looks through the new HDMI setup. So with that, Sammy, I'll be right back. Sammy, I have my camera now pointed directly at my modern TV here in my game room. I have your 2600 all connected up with your actual RGB to HDMI converter and cabling that you'll be receiving as part of this project. Now, before I show you the console, which I know you're really anxious to see, and I understand that, I've got to go through some basics on how to use the RGB to HDMI converter box, because it does have an on-screen menu with some various menu options that you're going to want to be familiar with. So remember I said at the beginning of the video that there are 4 buttons on the top of the box: SW1, SW2, SW3, and a reset button. The main buttons I'm going to focus on today are just the 3 SW buttons, the SW1, 2, and 3. SW1, if you push it quickly, brings up an on-screen menu like you see here. And then the SW2 and SW3 buttons are used to navigate a little cursor down and up through the menus. That's because each menu screen, the individual options are going to be options within that menu, and then there will be additional things that you can change for that particular option. So all of the menu screens, when you access them, will be labeled. Like as an example, if I go into the one here for the geometry menu, and if I push SW1 to confirm that, because not only is it the on-screen menu button, it's also like the OK or the Enter button, then you'll see that it changes to the geometry menu, and then I have additional options here that I can also change. Each menu screen also has a return at the top, and as the name implies, if you select it and hit SW1 to choose that, it will go back to the previous menu screen. And if you're on the main menu and you hit return and you press SW1, then it takes you back to your gameplay screen. What am I going to talk about specifically on this setup? Well, luckily in the case of the 2600, there's not a whole lot that has to be messed with, because for the most part, it's going to work really well out of the box. So I don't have a whole lot to have to talk about. But the first thing I am going to discuss is the option down here at the bottom called Select Profile. Now currently, if I move up here to the actual profile line, it says that we are on Atari 2600 Lumacode and it says no gen. Well, that's because if I go to Select Profile, and then from the Select Profile screen, if I cursor down to where it says Atari, because these are manufacturers, yes, you are looking at a sample of additional systems that have Lumacode capability to work through this little box. But if I go into Atari and I press SW1 to select into it, you will see that I have different profiles already in place for different Atari things. There's 2 for the 2600, there's one for the 5200, 7800, and then we have these 2 here which are for the Atari 8-bit computers. You're probably not going to mess with that one too much or ever, but you know, in the future you might get additional consoles and you might get them outfitted with Lumacode upgrades, and the profiles are there. So let's talk about the 2600 profiles, because again there are 2 of them. What's the difference between the first one, which just says Lumacode, and the bottom one that says Lumacode no Genlock? Well, you may or may not be aware of this, but several 2600 games, actually quite a few of them, weren't really programmed with the proper scanline counting method in place. Normal CRT televisions in the past really didn't care. They were very tolerant of this. So, you know, the programmers could be a little loose with the programming and kind of not do proper scan line setups on it or not proper scan line counting and get away with things. Unfortunately, modern TVs are not so cool about this. So what happens is when you play a certain 2600 game, if it has parts programmed into it that don't follow that proper scan line programming, then what happens is it can cause the video image to completely blank out for a second or two, and then it can take a second or two for it to resynchronize and show another picture. So some examples of games that have problems with this is Moon Patrol, which is an Atari released game. It has problems when it switches between the title screen to the gameplay screen where it can cause video dropouts. Another one that can do this is the game Empire Strikes Back from Parker Brothers. Whenever you actually shoot down the AT-ATs and they blow up and the screen starts flashing, that would also cause the video to drop out. So the reason for these two profiles is the very first one that just says Lumacode. That is basically like a normal conversion. That was the original profile that everyone used, but it was still susceptible to video dropout issues that used to occur. Well, the second one, called Lumacode No Genlock, adds a couple of frames of buffering in the video to help mitigate and combat against those video dropouts. Now, supposedly, if you use the No Genlock profile, it might add some lag between response control to what you see on the TV. I personally have not noticed this. In fact, I don't notice any difference in lag between using the Lumacode setup versus my S-Video setups on anything else. So I always use the No Genlock profile because that's going to be the one that's going to work the best for all of the different games, and I'm not going to have to worry about weird video dropout issues occurring. Or at least I shouldn't have to worry about it. So that's, you know, again, you're probably not going to have to mess with this too much, if ever. But I just wanted to explain what the difference was. Now, if you wanted to change profiles to something else, I do want to show you one thing. Let's say you get an Atari 5200 in the future and you want to switch to that profile. Well, I want you to see what happens to the menu screen when I switch to a different system, like the 5200. By the way, I'm going to press SW1 to select this. It's now changing everything and reprogramming itself specifically for supporting a 5200 console on Lumacode. But notice that the menu screen has completely changed. We have a completely different font style in use now. So that's just something to be aware of, that choosing different profiles between different consoles will very likely change the way the menu screen appears. So I'm going to go back to the 2600 No Genlock option, and you will see that it will change and look back to the way it did at the beginning. Essentially, it's reconfiguring the menu's output to match the screen resolution capability of the system that you're using. Okay, so that's how you select different profiles on the system. Again, for now, you won't have to worry about it because when you get it, I'm already going to have it in this Lumacode profile for the 2600, but just in case. What's another thing you're going to need to know about? Well, you might need to know about the geometry menu. That's because when you get the 2600 and you hook it up, you might find that the signal and the way it looks on your TV might not look the same as it does on mine. Specifically, the image might be shifted. Maybe it's too far to the left or the right. Maybe it's too high up. Maybe it's too far down. Well, we go to the geometry menu to realign and move the actual picture output. And honestly, the only two that you'll need to worry about to do that are these options here called the H offset for horizontal, left to right, and the V offset for vertical, which is up and down. So what you would do is let's say the image is, too far to the left or the right. Well, you would hit the SW1 on H offset. Now the cursor changes over here to show that we are now on 24. And when I use the SW2 and SW3 buttons, it reduces and increases the numbers. If I increase it, that'll move it to the right. Decreasing it, I believe, moves it to the left. I could have that backwards, but you get the idea. So that's really about the only option you'll probably ever have to play with in the geometry menu. Another menu you might have to mess around with is in the sampling menu. Now, I'm going to go into some more detail with this with actual picture imagery in the background to make it a little easier to see what I'm doing, but I'll briefly discuss what I'm going to show. So in the sampling menu, these are the options that you'll mainly need to be familiar with. That is going to be the one called sampling phase, currently set to 6. And the other options you may have to change are these options down here in the DAC settings. Specifically, you might have to change DAC A, DAC B, DAC E for the sync, and those are pretty much the only three I've ever had to touch for 2600s. That said, I've adjusted this already to work best with my equipment here. So hopefully it'll work great for you and you don't have to mess with it. But again, I'll go into more detail on how we make adjustments for that. The other thing I want to show you is, let's say you did have to change your picture alignment. Maybe it was too far to the left or the right or what have you, and you used the geometry menu to align it and put it where you wanted it. Well, you don't want to have to do that every time you power on the system, obviously. Well, if you go down here from the main menu and you go down to about the middle of the screen, there is a Save Configuration option. And when you choose that, it will then take any changes that you have done on any of the menu screens, and it now writes it to that profile that you're currently using. So now any changes that may have been made are now part of that default 2600 Lumacode no Genlock profile, which means the next time I power on the console, the RGB to HDMI always remembers which profile it was on previously, so it's not like you have to choose the profile every time, but it will already have any little configuration changes I've made already in place and just be ready to go. So that's a quick crash course on how to navigate and kind of use the RGB to HDMI and just a few menus that you may need to be familiar with. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn on your console, and I'm going to start with a really simple test cartridge. And before I go into too much other details on it, I'm going to show you a few more things on that menu. So here we go. You're about to see your console through HDMI output on my TV here in the game room. And here we are in a real simple little test program. And you can tell that the audio is working just fine. So let me reduce this down because it's pretty loud. There we go. By the way, that audio is coming through the HDMI cable. I do not have a separate set of speakers or anything like that plugged off the console. That's all going through HDMI and then eventually gets fed into my receiver, my AV receiver setup here in the game room. So before I go into talking about this, let me go back into the menu for the RGB to HDMI. And the reason why I didn't do this before is because it can be hard to see these menus now when you've got a background image. And I wanted you to be able to see it clearly first before I start showing you how things get changed. So the first thing I want to talk about is that sampling menu. Remember I said there were some, some things to kind of talk about on that? Okay, I think this will work. Let me go ahead and return out of this. Okay, well, it's going to be kind of hard to see, but maybe my camera will pick this up. So it still looks really good, but I have some weird little flickering multicolor things. If I look over here in the green, it's kind of flickery a little bit here. We can see it down here especially. I've got some weird little flickering dots. Kind of looks like there's some noise or something that's going on. Well, that's because I need to adjust the sampling phase on the system. So if I go back into my menus and I go back into the sampling menu option, the first thing I would want to do is to try changing different values for sampling phase. I actually purposely threw it off by putting it into 3, but as I will find out, see, like 2's really messed up there. If I go into like 5, pretty much starting with 5, 6, and 7, it's going to look perfect. And I tend to stick with 6 as a default. So yeah, that's one thing that may need to be changed. But you might also find that even after you've changed these sampling phase options, you might still have some sparkling artifacts that take effect. First of all, that can also be caused by using a really low quality HDMI cable. This only puts out 1080p, so it's not super specific. It doesn't have to have some massive high quality HDMI cable, but if your HDMI cable is excessively long, like let's say, 10 or 15 feet long, you might have some signal loss that starts to happen, and that would require maybe making some adjustments or trying a different HDMI cable to try to resolve it. But you can go in here and make adjustments to these offsets as well. Now, before making any changes, I would, either take a picture or jot down some of the number values, and I would only change the numbers like a couple of digits at a time, forward and back, to see what might work for you. But the values that you see currently should pretty much be good to go. Now, there's another thing we can do, and I'm not sure if this will do it properly. It usually won't. So I'm going to put it back here on 2. So this is really not right. There is a way to automatically adjust the caliber, or to automatically set the sampling phase. Now, there's 2 caveats on this. Number one, it's not 100% perfect, and the only thing it does is automatically go through those different sampling phase numbers to try to find the best fit. So it doesn't do anything with those other DAC offsets that I was talking about. And the other thing is it has to be on a completely static image to work. If it's not, it's going to think there's errors and problems when there really isn't. I'm not even sure if this screen's a good candidate, but we'll give it a try. But here's how you do the auto calibration for the sampling. If you push and hold down SW3, it will go into auto calibration mode. And what it is doing is it is going through every one of the different options for sampling phase, and then it's counting how many errors it still sees. Notice that it never gave us an option for 0. That's because the flickering of this particular menu screen is always going to be problematic. It's not a completely static image. Like I said, we pretty much have to have. Let's see what it put it to, just out of curiosity. Okay, it put it at 7. I'm going to go ahead and put it back to 6 because I happen to know that that's going to work just fine. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you another thing on the menu screens, but before I do that, let me go ahead and complete this little diagnostic. So this little basic diagnostic is a good test screen because it allows us to check controllers. So here's a controller in player 1. By the way, this is my wireless controller, and we don't have the weird little noises and sounds, so that's definitely fixed. And then I have a controller in player 2. It also allows us to see the functionality of the actual panel switches. So here's the color and black and white switch. It's currently in color. Now it's in black and white. So you can see that that's working properly. These are the difficulty switches for the left player and the right player, or player 1, player 2. Currently it's in position B. There it is in position A. And the other one. So those are working fine. And then we can see here when I'm pressing select and reset. So all of the switches are working wonderfully. But there's one other thing I want to show you real quick on this test, and this is the only cartridge that visually shows me this. Now I'm going to temporarily be unplugging the controllers, and that's because I'm going to replace it with something else. Okay, I now have a different set of controllers plugged in. What are they, you might ask? Well, take a look. I got paddles plugged in. That's right. Now my paddles are really jittery, but that's okay. I don't really play paddle games, so I don't really maintain them like I should. But those little bars at the bottom are for checking the paddle lines. And the reason why that's important is because, believe it or not, a lot of people will have an Atari console that they think is 100% functioning because all the joystick functions work, but then they find out when they go to play Kaboom or Breakout that the paddles aren't working. And that's because the paddle controls are actually handled by a different chip inside the console than what handles the actual joystick. So it's possible to have a functioning Atari where the actual joysticks work, but then you go to use paddles and they don't work because there's another chip that's faulty. So yes, I like to also use this test to purposely demonstrate and make sure and show that the paddles will work. And that's basically a real quick diagnostic. I know, not really super fancy, but it's about the best visually thing I can show you. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some games. And I'm going to use my Harmony Encore cartridge for this. I believe you said you just purchased a Harmony Encore, so this will be perfect. But there's a real important reason why I'm showing this. So here is the Harmony Encore up and running, but there's a bit of a problem. It looks good, but notice that the word Harmony is cut off at the top. What is that all about? Well, this is why I wanted to show you the geometry menu. So some Atari 2600 games may shift up too high or too low when you're playing them, and that's why you're going to want to be familiar with the geometry menu. So I'm going to go into the menu options, I'm going to go in here to the geometry menu, and I'm going to go into the vertical offset. That's the one that controls up and down. It's currently set for 38. Now I happen to know that reducing this down to 30, at least on my TV, fixes the issue. Now I can fully see the word Harmony, and I can still see the last option here, which is manual, and everything fits on the screen properly. Now, I don't want to have to make that adjustment every time, so remember I said I can go in here into the main menu and I can tell it to save the configuration? Well, I'm going to choose that option, I'm going to press SW1, and now it's going to save that little geometry adjustment to the Lumacode profile. So now the next time I power on the console, I won't have to worry about it. It's going to be ready to go. Awesome. All right, let's take a look at a couple of quick games. I'm not super good at it, but it is a fun one to watch. Okay, let's go ahead and get a game started. Get some more volume. Cool. Well, Sammy, there you go. There's your 2600 Lite 6er. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of the video was that, of course, another upgrade that I installed was the stealthily installed power LED. I'm not sure if it'll show up on my camera here, but I can certainly see it here. And again, it is just one of my cyan/turquoise colored LEDs that lights up whenever the console is powered on. So what is the plan from here? Well, it is currently Friday night. It is February 13th. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day. So my plan is to get this video edited as quickly as I can tonight, and I'm going to get it uploaded to my YouTube channel. And from there, I will send you a link to this video along with any pictures that I've taken of the work that's been done inside the console. I know I've already shown you quite a few pictures already, but there's others that you haven't quite seen yet that you might find interesting. Now, the video will be an unlisted video on my YouTube channel. That's for the privacy of my clients. However, you're free to share that link with anyone you want if there's others that you want to be able to view it with you. Additionally, I believe YouTube gives you the option to download that video as well. So that might be something that you could also do if you wanted to keep a copy of the video for yourself. From there, I'm then going to focus on getting everything boxed back up, get it secured back into the box. I think the box that you originally used is going to be just big enough for me to be able to put everything together, including the new RGB to HDMI converter setup. One other thing that I wanted to mention is that in addition to the RGB to HDMI, I will also be providing this little bag that has all of the original old capacitors and any other parts that I may have removed and or replaced. So as an example, your console had these really giant monster polycaps on it, which have now been replaced with these tiny little white ceramic-based ones. So that's kind of interesting. I also did put a brand new replacement standard voltage regulator on your console in addition to the second one that's providing the power for the controller ports. But yeah, you'll be getting this back just so that you can see for yourself the parts that have been replaced out and installed. And also you might want to hold on to these parts as part of the history of the console. Some of my clients will do that. Some of my other clients just toss them in the trash. It's really entirely up to them. But I want them to at least see what's been done. So that will also be included with the rest of everything else. So with that, Sammy, thank you again for your patience and for working with me and for your excellent communication back and forth, letting me know whenever I had things that I wanted to talk to you about and providing an answer back to me. So once I get your console sent back out, headed your way, look for another email that will have the tracking information in addition to any additional remaining amount that might be owed on this project. I know that you've already prepaid a considerable amount of money for this. Thank you. I do appreciate that. Most of my clients only pay half up front. But of course, there was a little more work involved with the additional changes and modifications that had to be made for the wireless controllers to work. So, I'll have to add a little bit extra for those parts and labor. So again, Sammy, thank you. And I hope you're pleased with everything whenever you receive it back. Let me know whenever you have the system back in hand, and also be sure to reach out to me if you have any questions on the usage of the RGB to HDMI setup, or any other questions you might have with anything that's been discussed in this video, and I'll be more than happy to answer and provide more details. So again, have a good upcoming weekend and a happy Valentine's Day tomorrow for you and hopefully a special someone, and perhaps I'll catch you on another project in the future. Thanks.